A tropical depression trying to develop off the west coast of Florida will bring impacts to parts of our area. Your forecast across the Caribbean and the Bahamas starts right now.
This is Meteo Mundo.
Hi friends, Rusty back here at Meteo Mundo. Great to see you on this Tuesday afternoon. Coming up, we've got a tropical depression trying to develop off the west coast of Florida. This is going to bring some heavy rain and other impacts to portions of our northwest areas. We continue to get some storms down in the Windward Islands and just a overall very active weather pattern for us here. There is so much to get into, and as we do that, I thank you so much for liking this video. We'll get started right away. Look, it's a blessing and a curse to be able to show you all these things. This is my rundown where I kind of scribble everything I want to go over, and there's a lot to do so. So the first thing we're going to do, guys, is we're going to kind of nowcast this invest area. And we do have our first invest of the hurricane season. We had one way out in the eastern Atlantic in May, but for the one here in June, the first one. So this is our active invest 90L. All right. It is very weak. Maximum sustained winds are just 22 miles an hour. And what's going to be happening is there's going to be the opportunity that we get a tropical depression trying to form either here or as it moves east and into the western Atlantic. Appreciably, it's not going to really change the forecast. Sands will have a little bit more wind if there is a closed center of circulation, and maybe a little bit more in the way of some storm surge. But you want to talk about some very heavy rain already breaking out through central and south Florida and portions of the northwest Bahamas. Now, one of the things that we can look at here, and this is going to be a very key tool as we get into the heart of hurricane season, is not only can we look at all of the different reporting sites on land, but I have access to all the buoys and all of the ships data. That's right, ships traversing the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Sometimes they give out weather information and we can highlight that. So let's look at the buoy and let's look at the ships data. The first thing I notice here is off of the Sarasota coastline, we are getting some wind gusts of around 35 miles an hour. Now they're just in gusts, but these are very blustery conditions moving in to portions of west central Florida down into southwest Florida as well. It's been very, very windy and wet in the northwest Bahamas. Freeport, that's the west end sensor there. They again have had some pretty strong gusts from time to time there. Now that is kind of looking at the gusts each hour. There's something also called sustained wind gusts, and we can look at that, and you'll see the one out of West End reported, I believe, close to a 40-mile-an-hour wind gust here, at least when I last looked at it. So it's a little bit lower, but still upper 30s. It's been a very blustery day and a very wet day over the northwest Bahamas, and certainly the heavy rain is going to be an issue there. And you can see that reporting station south of the Bradenton, Sarasota area, nearly 40-mile-an-hour winds. But again, these are just in gusts. I've mentioned it in the last several videos. Whatever this is going to end up being is fighting a lot of dry air on the north and the western side. So really what the Hurricane Center thinks is as it gets into this yellow area, that's when it could actually develop into a tropical depression. And obviously our friends, sorry about that, in Bermuda would be one of the areas, I'm sliding all around today, in Bermuda would be one of the areas that would have to monitor that. And there's healthy thunderstorms headed towards Bermuda with this huge plume of moisture. So that's kind of what it looks like as far as the broad setup. We'll take a look at the water vapor imagery. And again, it's very clear to see, as I've mentioned, we're fighting dry air on the western side. But what happens now is that all that rich moisture has turned to the east, and so Cuba and the Bahamas are really in for it as far as some of that heavier rain. We can look at the radar, and that's what we're going to do next for us here. So we'll switch over to the radar. This is a live composite radar here on this Tuesday afternoon. It's raining cats and dogs through the northwest Bahamas, Walker's Key, Grand Bahama, Freeport, Lucaya, Bimini. It's been a little bit more scattered towards Abaco so far for today, but all of this is tracking to the east. And again, I've mentioned it, it really is the extreme northwest Bahamas with the best chance for heavy rain and flooding potential over the next several days. Doesn't mean places like Andros and Nassau and New Providence and Eleuthera won't get in on the act, but you get a little bit south of there and it really does become a lot more spotty in nature. It's going to be very heavy rain for all of South and Central Florida. We have a lot of folks who watch Meteo Mundo in Florida, and again, we could be talking about more than a foot of rain in a couple of spots. It's getting really wet out there, and then again, this rain goes back down to Cuba, and you notice that south moisture plume feeding feeding right in to this broad disturbance. So those are kind of the setups of the here and the now with this disturbance, which could potentially become our first tropical depression of the year. Now, the GFS really hones in on it, guys. It's basically saying there's going to be a depression potentially even before it moves across the state. Now, the European model is not really agreeing with that. But again, just so you guys know that the GF has really ramped up trying to wrap up a closed low here in the southeast Gulf of Mexico, just west of Florida. Ocean temperatures certainly support it. It's bathwater out there, guys. These are in Celsius, but you can see we have a lot of areas at or above 30 degrees. And the last time we looked at this graphic, there was more areas of red, okay, which is in the upper 20s Celsius. Now, basically, all of the Gulf of Mexico, the Western and the Central Caribbean are at or above 30 degrees Celsius, and those numbers encompass most of the Leeward Islands as well. It's very few areas here that are below 30 degrees Celsius for ocean temperatures. So the bathwater out there certainly supports that ability. Okay, so let's get into, we're going to forecast kind of this area out over the next several days, and then we're going to take a look and reset for everyone else. But we do want to focus in on our friends in the Bahamas and Cuba and the Northwest Caribbean for this system. So the first thing we're going to look at here, of course, is just the GFS model and how it plays out the rain over the next 5 days. The bottom line is, even on the GFS, it stays a relatively sloppy system. But again, it's going to be the rainfall. That's going to be the biggest issue. There'll be some wind, and there'll be some wind gusts, but that's not going to be the main hazard out of this. This is going to be the excessive rainfall potential for South Florida, the Northwest Bahamas, portions of Cuba, and even the Yucatan Peninsula and the Northwest Caribbean. Again, just you guys are obviously far south and west of this, but that tropical plume with that Central American gyre we talked about yesterday is still driving in an ample amount of moisture. Now, again, eventually this shifts off towards the east. Bermuda will get hit at least with some heavy rain and gusty winds, regardless of whether this forms. And again, if it does, I believe it's going to be very weak in nature, but that's the overall scenario. So the bottom line is, for the Northwest Bahamas, just get ready for a very wet week. There's going to be rounds of heavy rain. There'll be some flooding potential. There is a flood watch that is currently in effect, and I'll go over that in a minute. Obviously, sea conditions are going to be pretty rough. A lot of small craft are going to want to remain in port with small craft advisories and some very gusty winds. But I'm just letting this roll, guys, over the next 5 days, and it's not really until we get to the weekend that we do begin to dry out. I think the rest of today, certainly Wednesday, Thursday, absolutely wet. Friday kind of maybe is the day we start to see pivoting to a little bit drier forecast, but it just stays very sloppy and wet in this area. So that's what it looks like as far as the rain. Let's go over to what it looks like in the wind here. There's a couple different products I want to show you guys. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put on the wind gusts, and I'll let that loop up. And again, even on the GFS, you know, we don't get anything extremely tight here, despite the fact that the ensemble members were saying that there's a very high chance of a tropical storm or tropical depression. Again, it kind of doesn't really play out, at least in the Gulf of Mexico. But as it gets into the Western Atlantic here, you can start to see right at the very end, there's a bit of a wrap up, but it's still going to be fighting dry air on the western side. But again, for our friends closer to Bermuda, you get close to getting some maybe 30 plus knot winds later in the week. Now, for the Northwest Bahamas, again, as these showers and storms just pull in with this tropical moisture, we're just going to continue to get very breezy conditions. Nothing crazy, but you saw the reporting station out of Weston where it was pretty sustained over 20 and 30 miles an hour. And I think that's just going to be the case. There's just going to be a lot of 20 and 30 mile an hour winds with this that could be fairly consistent. All right, maybe nothing more than that, but pretty consistent. And again, it does drop off pretty quickly. It's a big change into the the central and the southeast Bahamas, and still a lot of wind energy driving through portions of the Northwest Caribbean as well. We haven't even talked about the Pacific. It's very, again, clear to see this broad spin. And we're going to talk about how now we have an area in the East Pacific that could develop and how that might change the forecast for a couple of areas a little bit as well. Let's get into the spin so we can look at what's called the vorticity product here. So give me 1 second of that. I like to show you this because, again, it allows us to take a look at where we might have some twist in the atmosphere and a little bit of spin up. Now, obviously in this area, there's going to be an ample amount of lift and twist overall in a broad perspective. So what we're really trying to focus in on is if the GFS model picks up on anything a little bit tighter. And again, we can see that right in the area in yellow. So you interpret this as the Hurricane Center has this invest. It's not expecting it to develop as it moves across Florida, but in the next couple of days, as it gets into this area in yellow, we could have our first tropical depression of the season. Of course, that would get a number. We need a tropical storm to get our first named storm of the year. But that's kind of the overall scenario here, okay? Let me just make sure I got everything I want to talk about here. We'll look at rainfall totals in this area as well, okay? And then again, like I said, we're going to get into everyone else's forecast. But for our friends in the Northwest Bahamas, and again, it's a very stark contrast here, okay? So let's take a look at some of the numbers here on the GFS, where again, it just really depends. Now, some of this heavier rain is just north of even Walker's Key or just west towards Bimini. But you'll see that the Department of Meteorology in the Bahamas has issued this flood watch for 2 to 4 inches of rain. But almost every model that I look at has more than that in most of the extreme Northwest Bahamas. But again, it's a fairly sharp change on the south and eastern sides, where you get towards Marsh Harbor and Dunmore and Nassau and Androstown and Arthurstown and south, and the rain isn't nearly as prominent. And we are, by the way, just so we're clear, still pinging on nearly a foot of rain in southwest Florida with locally higher amounts. When you have the training effect down here, I promise you the models can't handle some of the very heavy rainfall. There could be 15 and even 20 inches of rain on the southwest coast of Florida out of this. It's going to be a big flood maker for areas like Fort Myers and Naples. So for the Northwest Bahamas, flood watch through Friday. 2 to 4 inches of rain, but really locally higher amounts. And we can handle 2 to 4 in most areas, but more than likely we're gonna get some spots that go above that. Obviously that leads to localized flooding. Could see some funnel clouds as well. Again, small craft should exercise caution and remain in port, especially with all the heavy rain and thunderstorms that are gonna be coming into play. So friends, that's kind of the outlook of what's gonna be happening in our far northwest areas. I do wanna remind everyone that we're across social media, and the reason why, if you look, we do have an email address, okay? And if you have a picture or a video in the areas across our area, but especially, again, if you have some active weather, send that to me at myMediaMundo@gmail.com. I would love to include it here on some of the videos that we do on YouTube. We are across all of social media, and we do some exclusive content on TikTok as well, so look for that. I normally put this at the end of the video, but I wanted to highlight again, what's our social media handle. So if you want to send me a picture or video, you can do so. Now, what's another big story? Obviously, we're going to see the seas kicked up as this disturbance moves through. We're still going to have some 7 to 9 foot waves possible in central and western sides of the Caribbean with our Central American gyre we talked about yesterday. And again, the possibility of a disturbance trying to develop, but it's still going to feed a lot of moisture over portions of Central America. So let's get into the forecast for kind of everyone else we haven't talked about here. First thing I want to look at on this Tuesday afternoon is just how hot it is across the area, because we're talking about a ton of rain here. We've had some storms developing in portions of Central America, but there's been a lot of drier locations for today, with temperatures on the board right now well above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of areas even above that. Feels like numbers are very, very rough outside right now, okay? So let's get into kind of what's going on in your area. First of all, we haven't had as much storm activity in the Northwest Caribbean so far today. We've had some flooding in places like Grand Cayman, but it's been drier. And look what happens, again, just one day when it dries out, Georgetown feels like temperature is above 110. More storms today in the Yucatan, especially along the coastline, Cancun and Cozumel, but some of those have tried to drift off towards the south. Once again, we're trying to get a little bit more rain here in portions of Belize, but look at Belize City's feels like temperature above 115 for the afternoon hours. And it's been a little bit drier today in Honduras and Nicaragua. One of the reasons why is, and we're going to talk about and how this might impact it, is if this system is going to try and wrap up a little bit more, it could try and yank some of the moisture over Central America and drive it a little bit farther off towards the west, at least in the short term. And you can see that on the water vapor imagery. There's just a little bit more drier air in place. Now, one of the biggest challenges of the forecast, to be honest, is does that drier air stick around, or does this moisture plume redevelop? And we'll talk about, again, some of the areas that could be impacting there. Our friends in Jamaica, a little bit drier day for today overall. Again, some of you have come in and said, Rusty, I've had a couple of downpours, but generally speaking, not a lot of activity across the island right now, with feels like numbers in Montego Bay up to 108 degrees. And again, the areas that have been so wet over the last few weeks are now the dry areas, like the Dominican Republic and Haiti and the Turks and the Caicos. Again, rough afternoon, feels like temperatures 110 or more. And again, 110 in Fahrenheit is 43.3 degrees Celsius. We have excessive heat warnings in effect for all of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands right now. Feels like temperatures there well above 105 to 110. And guys, this is just going to continue. There's not much of a difference here as you get into the northern side of the Leeward Islands, the Lesser Antilles. And again, feels like temperatures dependent. Could there be a isolated downpour? Absolutely. Is it going to be widespread? No. And there'll be a little bit of Saharan dust that'll be moving in, so watch out for some haze here as well. Antigua, Barbuda, Montserrat, Guadeloupe, Dominica, south towards our friends in Martinique and St. Lucia. Barbados drying out for today as well. St. Vincent and the Grenadines still seeing a few showers trying to trickle through. Trinidad, Tobago, and potentially even Grenada. It's those areas that have the best opportunity. And we've mentioned how these tropical waves still are at low latitude, so they're really impacting more portions of South America like Guyana and Suriname and Venezuela. But again, on the heels of this tropical wave, the intertropical convergence zone is still very active, and there are multiple waves still to come through. But if we're going to really bring more rain to the Lesser Antilles in general, we have to get these tropical waves to go a little bit higher in latitude to really provide the benefits as far as that goes. Okay. So I think we've covered that pretty well. I'll say this real quick for the ABC Islands. Again, it's pretty dry. There could be an isolated shower or two, but I feel like I've been mentioning this forecast for Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, where we cross our fingers for some rain, but it's been generally dry. It's been brisk winds out there, and feels like temperatures have been at or above 100 degrees. So we'll go back over to the broad perspective, and we'll look at the GFS model over the next 5 days. And as I'm doing so, thank you so much for liking this video. If you haven't become a subscriber yet to Meteo Mundo and you're getting something out of this video, do me a big favor, click that subscribe button right now. Comment in the section below what the weather has been like in your area. And again, thank you for sharing this this page with your family and friends and helping support us, what we're doing here at Meteo Mundo. I absolutely appreciate it. All right, so we'll get over to the reflectivity. I just want to make sure, I think I can loop it up and it'll just work fine here. Okay, we're good to go. So let's break down. We've already really focused in on what's happening in northwest areas. What's going to happen over the next 5 days for everyone else? Well, in general, we begin to dry out through portions of the Lesser Antilles. There's another wave coming in Friday and into the weekend. Again, it's a pretty south latitude wave, so you're looking at our far southern areas trying to catch a little bit more rain over the weekend. But after today, the entire island chain dries out with just a couple isolated showers. There's no more rain right now in the forecast for Puerto Rico, all of the Virgin Islands, Hispaniola, very isolated in nature for the Turks and the Caicos. I mentioned it. Again, we miss most of this rain to the north there. The interesting parts of this forecast really become places like Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. The models just really aren't handling the moisture very well. They're flip-flopping on the solutions, okay? And I tell you guys, when I feel very confident about certain things, I don't have a high confidence forecast as far as rain goes for these areas. You notice that the GFS is basically dry or drier over the next 5 days. I'll show you the NAM as well, but the European model has actually backed off of some of the rain here as well. What it's actually trying to do is translate some of the heaviest rain farther west. Now, this obviously benefits Central America. Now, look, portions of like Costa Rica and Panama, I don't really need any more rain right now, but Nicaragua and Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala and Belize and the Yucatan certainly could. And the GFS is aligning more with the European model and taking some of that really heavy moisture plume and driving it west. And part of the reason, again, why that might be happening is we're trying to spin up this area here. So if I put on the winds in this area, and we'll look at the gusts over the next 5 days here, and extended, it gets even a little bit more interesting, to be quite honest. Look at, first of all, again, a little bit of a bullseye spin here, but look at that just broader twist, especially right there. You can kind of see it. And by the way, that gets interesting into the southwest Gulf of Mexico next week, some wind energy on the tip of the Yucatan, and then what might be happening, because believe it or not, there's an opportunity that whatever tries to develop here moves north over Mexico and gets into the southwest Gulf of Mexico. Little preview of what I'll be watching for next week. Let's talk about the rain chances in your area. Bahamas, again, guarantee. Central and southeast Bahamas, it's more scattered in nature. You're still going to get some tropical downpours, but just not consistent enough to really be concerned about any flooding. Turks and Caicos, I've dried you out a bit. For Cuba, again, fairly wet weather. We'll start to see that system pull away, and then it does get a little bit drier. Cayman Islands, again, I'm going to put you at a 50% chance. Do expect some showers there, but I've had to back off of the rain just at least a little bit. Belize City, again, at least a 50% chance for showers. Now look, my friends in Belize, it is a progression thing. We're not going to bust the drought in one day, but the fact that we can continue to talk about pretty good rain chances in your area is great news. There will be some areas that don't get rain for a few days in a row, but we want to look at the accumulation of that. And over the next 7 to 10 days, there still is a nice high opportunity. Same thing for Cancun and Cozumel. Rain chances remain high. Jamaica, you're down to a 30% chance. Again, many dry hours and locations. It's virtually dry, sans an isolated pop-up storm with the heat of the day in Puerto Rico and the U.S. and the British Virgin Islands. Bermuda, some showers on the way there and some wind. I'll be tracking that. Ceiba and Montserrat stay relatively dry. Again, sans a pop-up shower. Same thing for Antigua and Barbuda. St. Lucia and Grenada starts to tail off their rain chances. Suriname stays relatively high. More rain on the way, rain away of the weekend. Barbados, a few showers for today, but again, relatively dry. Trinidad, Tobago, best chance today as the tropical wave departs west. You begin to dry out, and again, we'll be very lucky if we catch a couple of isolated showers in portions of the ABC Islands. I mentioned the NAM model, so I'm happy to show you guys that. And the reason why is I'm going to make sure it goes to reflectivity here, is I did talk about how it's a little bit different forecast on the NAM for portions of the Grand Cayman Islands in general and Jamaica. Now, it's just a little bit wetter here in the NAM. At least a few more showers overall. But that's really the only areas that differ. We still see that spin on the NAM. We still see the axis of heaviest moisture and best widespread rain to the west, but there's a little bit more activity here in the Northwest Caribbean. And by the way, just on the NAM's always been a little bit stronger with this system. There's a little bit more twist here and certainly kicking out waves of energy. And by the way, on the NAM, some of the heavier rainfall goes a little bit farther north into Florida. You can see the European models rain totals. And again, I'm going to take myself off screen, but if you look, it has shifted a little bit farther west as well. Very high rainfall totals over Central America and the Yucatan. Obviously, extremely high rainfall totals over southern Florida, the far northwest tip of the Bahamas. I mean the far northwest tip of the Bahamas, literally Grand Bahama and Walker's Key. And notice how sharp that gradient is with the rain. Again, the Cayman Islands are drier. Jamaica is drier now, but wetter for areas off towards the west. And again, the Lesser Antilles and really most of the Greater Antilles tend to be a little bit on the drier side as well. So I want to go back over here real quickly, bring myself back on camera, because we can look at the total precip from the GFS model, okay? GFS model is virtually the same. Again, it dries out these areas just like the European does. The NAM is a little bit wetter, but overall, guys, overall, the models certainly agree with where some of this heavier rain is going to be. And again, you could be talking about now into portions of the Yucatan getting over a half foot of rain over the next 5 days if the models play out. And even Belize City, right? And San Ignacio and Belmopan, now we're talking about several more inches of rain. So again, I know it can be frustrating when you want the rain in Belize and other areas like the Yucatan that have been desperately dry, but if we can be a little bit patient, overall, we're going to try and get you guys some fairly significant rain. Again, not saying it's drought busting, but these numbers will help out at least the short-term situation in these areas. Extensive, really nasty heavy rainfall along the western coastline, the Pacific coastline of the Central American coast. And again, just really, really spotty. You can see how quickly we've dried out there. For places like Bermuda, And again, you kind of right on the edge of seeing that heavier rain, but at least a couple of inches of rain is possible there. All right, guys, I think that's going to do it for us here. One more time, broad perspective. We're watching this disturbance moving into the western Atlantic. Very heavy rain in the flood watch for Bahamas. Still a few showers down on the windward islands right now. If you're hot and humid and you're dry, generally you're going to be hot and humid and dry for the next several days. Still monitoring some very wet situations out in our western areas. And by the way, before I go, and I hope you haven't clicked off this video, I do want to do one more thing. Stand by. Because this actually gets interesting as well. Let me go back over to the wind gusts. This is almost like kind of a like a bonus feature. So let me just show you guys. I mentioned the southwest Gulf of Mexico, okay? And I'm going to bring this out to the end here. And let me get over to gusts. Well, let's see. Why is that going to reflectivity? Let's see. There we go. Okay. So I just want to show you guys that we talked about the Central American gyre yesterday, and you can see that broad spin. Well, looky here what happens in the Bay of Campeche maybe about 8-9 days from now. It would be very interesting that we might pull some of the energy in the Pacific, and this happens sometimes, and gets it into the Gulf of Mexico with more spin. But the bottom line is this area stays very, very active, at least the next 7 to 10 days, and there still is a lot of tropical wind coming in, right? Keeping this area active, and we still have our tropical waves to monitor as well. But for our western areas, again, very interesting scenario here. Just wanted to show you that on the GFS, there's a little bit of a spin up right there in the Bay of Campeche, again, over the next, let's say, 7 to 10 days. Okay, friends, that's the latest. I hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday. You know I've got you covered here. Thank you for liking and subscribing. If you'd like to become a member at Meteo Mundo, you can click that video right now. I'll see you soon right here at Meteo Mundo.